The most thought-provoking thing in our thought-provoking time is that we are still not thinking. Our story doesn't begin at Simon Fraser University, but rather, it starts with Martin Heidegger, who was born on September 26, 1889, in the rural city of Meßkirch, Germany, to be exact, in Baden-Württemberg, and he died on May 26, 1976, at the age of 86. He was the youngest of three, and loved to go for long walks in nature in rural Germany. Born into a Roman Catholic family, Martin's father was a church officer, and because of this, his childhood education started at a Jesuit school of theology. He grew up being a bellboy and a choir singer in his church, and his high school was a monastery run by Jesuit priests. As a result, Martin grew up with aspirations of being a priest, and he continued his theological studies at the University of Freiburg. But around the early 1900s, his professor at the university, Edmund Husserl, proposed his phenomenological theories and methods, and Logical Investigations and Ideas 1. After reading some of Husserl's writings, Heidegger took up philosophy instead. And in 1913, now in his 20s, Heidegger got his PhD in philosophical discourse focusing on psychologism. The difficulty Heidegger was facing was that he was losing his strong Christian ideologies, but needed the church's monetary support and publication resources as well in order to teach at the university level in Germany. And in 1915, it was a requirement to complete a habilitation thesis, and Heidegger did just that, focusing his studies on the theologian John Scotus. But the following year, after reading classical Protestant texts by Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others, led him to a spiritual crisis, which led him to renounce his Roman Catholic ways, and it was finalized by marrying a Lutheran, Alfred Petri, in 1917. He was heavily influenced in his works by the scholars Heinrich Rickert, a Neo-Kantianism philosopher, and Edmund Husserl. Following the footsteps of his teacher Husserl, he continued to expand on phenomenology, which is a philosophical approach that looks at phenomena, or how things appear, through examining our experience of them. In 1923, Heidegger was appointed Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Marburg. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, his interest in philosophy was inspired by his reading on the several senses of being in Aristotle by the German philosopher Franz Brentano. Heidegger's early philosophical development were influenced by scholars in the late 20th century by the publication of transcripts of lectures he delivered in the 1920s. They showed the influence of a number of thinkers and themes, including Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard's concern for irreducible uniqueness of the individual, which was important in Heidegger's early existentialism, Aristotle's conception of practical wisdom, which helped Heidegger to define the peculiar being of the human individual in terms of a set of worldly involvements and commitments. Heidegger attained tenure at Marburg University after publishing his most influential book, Being and Time, which took the next big step into philosophical inquiry about the nature of existence. As a side note, although Heidegger never fought directly in the First World War due to having some heart issues, having also seen the devastation, death, and shift in his country's political and economic structure during World War I played a role in his work by attributing guilt, anger, as part of the nature of being. As history has shown us, there was a huge amount of exile and immigration following the First World War, with countries such as Germany occupying neighboring countries Belgium, northern France, Poland, Lithuania, and others, or Russia expanding on Eastern Balkan countries, or the Ottoman Empire extending their reach north to Armenia and more, sparking a huge number of refugees fleeing countries as well as state deportations taking place simultaneously. This was further aggravated during World War II when we saw Nazi Germany take over multiple countries and establish concentration camps as part of the Aryan expansion into Europe. During the 1930s, for a few years, Heidegger was also an avid supporter of Hitler and the Nazi regime. This was more or less based on his notions that a great nation should have a great leader. But his mustache said there was more to that than just a philosophical justification. Later on in his life, he realized that the National Socialist Party was probably not the best affiliation to undertake, but no formal apologies were made. There is so much to be said about exile and immigration taking place during World War II, with both Germans fleeing persecution as well as neighboring countries doing their best to keep themselves safe from the war. At the time, Germany was sending Heidegger to philosophical conventions until late 1939. But post-World War II, since he was an avid supporter of Hitler, he was not allowed to teach lectures anymore since he was a hardcore fascist intellectual, and so he lived in rural areas of Germany. But after making some reconciliation with his old fascist ways, French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre expanded on his writings on being. Heidegger again becomes very famous, especially in France. Martin Heidegger becomes hugely influential since he affected different fields such as existentialism, psychology, and linguistics since he questions the fundamental questions of existence and being. Heidegger did have a few key works, namely, in 1927 he wrote Being and Time, where Heidegger applies a complex method to uncover the meaning of human being. In 1936 to 1953, he wrote Overcoming Metaphysics, where Heidegger critiques metaphysics by looking at the relationship between metaphysics and thought, stating that, by getting to the deepest level of oneself, one's thrown openness as the radically finite and mortal field of meaningfulness that ungirds and nourishes everything human. In 1955 to 1956, he wrote The Principle of Reason, which takes on its focal points of Leibniz's principle, nothing is without reason. Heidegger shows here that the principle of reason is in fact a principle of being. In 1955 to 1957, he wrote Identity and Difference, where Heidegger discusses the difficult problem of the nature of identity and the history of metaphysics. But it was Being and Time that shined the brightest, since it articulated that it is only humans who ask questions like, what does it mean to exist? Hence, we are the entities to be analyzed. He states that the meaning of our being must be tied up with time, since we are mortal and death is inevitable. He called this Dasein, or situated moment of consciousness, i.e. existence. The reason things exist is because we perceive them to be. When we see the truth of one thing, we understand it in exclusion of other concealed truths, like a camera only being able to focus on one thing. The most fundamental condition for something to exist is time. We have to make it present to us in order to bring it into existence in the present moment. Truth is revealed and concealed to us alternatively, since we can only view one thing at a time. Hence the title, Being and Time. For Heidegger, being only exists in time. He was famously known to recommend people go for walks in graveyards in order to self-reflect and attain more authenticity. It's the contrast of not living forever that we can appreciate our existence now. This helps us to live an authentic life, true by understanding the past and the future. He recommends that people take ownership of their lives by remaining open to new views of the world. His work influenced many great writers afterwards. He spent the last 30 years of his life traveling and writing, exchanging ideas with friends such as Hannah Arendt and the physicist Werner Heisenberg. In the 1940s, Jean-Paul Sartre publishes Being and Nothingness, which looks at the connection between being and human freedom. Without a doubt, Heidegger is one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, and his greatest literary work, Being and Time, is hailed to be one of the most dense and hardest pieces of literature to follow, since he tried to stay away from philosophical abstractions. Perhaps this is telling us of how difficult the answer to our question of being and existence truly is. Or maybe, like the Taoists say, trying to explain existence to somebody is like trying to explain water to a fish. It is always born with it and can never explain its essence to other fish. The question of existence never gets straightened out except through existing itself.